Ever get curious about where your tax dollars actually go?
I mean, who doesn't?
Right. We're talking billions upon billions spent by the government on everything,
Everything.
from fighter jets to office supplies.
Oh, yeah, you know those office supplies.
Gotta love them. But seriously, imagine someone taking advantage of that system.
Oh, absolutely.
That's what we're diving into today, procurement fraud.
And it's not just about someone walking off with a stapler.
Although I'm sure that happens too.
Probably happens every day. But we're talking about schemes so big they can drain taxpayer dollars, throw a wrench into essential government services.
Even pose a risk to national security.
Oh, absolutely. The stakes can be incredibly high.
So to guide us through this intricate web, we're using two incredibly insightful resources.
All right, let's hear it.
First, we've got the Fraud Examiner's Manual. It's basically the ultimate guide to uncovering financial crimes.
All sorts of financial crimes, from creative accounting
To outright theft.
It's a fascinating look at the breadth of schemes out there.
And to zero in on how these schemes play out in government contracts, we're also tapping into the Procurement Fraud Handbook.
Ah, yes, a classic.
This one's from the GSA's Office of Inspector General. They're the folks who see this stuff firsthand, so you know it's gotta be good.
They've got the inside scoop for sure.
They do. And one thing that really struck me is how those schemes from the manual can be tailored to procurement. Think inflated invoices, companies pretending to be something they're not to secure contracts, even cases of identity theft, all to game the system.
It's like they've got a whole playbook of ways to work the system.
Exactly.
And it's unsettling for sure. But thankfully,
Thankfully what?
the GSA's handbook is packed with red flags they've identified over years of experience.
It's like they're handing us a roadmap to spot these shady dealings.
Exactly. They're saying, here's what to look out for.
So let's jump right into those red flags.
Let's do it.
First up, we've got bid rigging.
Ah, bid rigging, one of the classics.
Which sounds exactly like what it is.
Competitors secretly working together to decide who wins a contract,
Creating the illusion of a fair competition.
when in reality, the outcome is predetermined.
And we've got a real-world example, right?
Oh yeah, a classic case. The Mount Sinai Medical Center case. A former official there admitted to rigging bids in exchange for kickbacks.
Wow. Ensuring a specific company would win those contracts.
Exactly. A system rigged against taxpayers.
Then there's the issue of defective pricing, which is a bit more complex.
A bit more nuanced.
Essentially, when a contractor hides information about discounts.
They offer to other customers, like commercial businesses, allowing them to charge the government a much higher price.
Sneaky. For the same product or service.
Oh, absolutely. And we're talking big numbers here.
Like how big?
Oracle Corporation had to pay nearly $100 million to settle allegations of not giving the government the same discounts they offered others.
Wow.
And EMC Corporation.
They got busted too.
Oh, yeah. $87.5 million for similar practices.
That really puts it into perspective. These companies are clearly playing a high-stakes game. But what about those cases where contractors bill for work they never even did?
Oh, you're talking about products not used, services not rendered.
That's just plain wrong.
It is, and sadly, more common than you might think, especially in fields like construction, consulting, or inspections.
Where it might be harder to track exactly what's been done.
Exactly. Much easier to get away with it.
It's like charging someone for a 5-course meal when all they got was a bag of chips.
Right.
And then there's the good old-fashioned bribery and kickbacks.
Ah, the classics never go out of style.
Offering anything of value to sweeten the deal and secure favorable treatment.
And often involving conflicts of interest, further compromising the integrity of the process.
It's a blatant abuse of power, like that case with the CEO of Holiday International Security who ended up in prison for bribing a GSA employee to score millions of dollars in contracts.
And it's not just individuals. Boeing, for example, a massive company, agreed to a $615 million settlement for similar unethical behavior.
Clearly, this kind of misconduct has serious consequences. But what about cases where the product itself is the problem? I'm thinking about things like substituting materials for cheaper alternatives.
You're talking about product substitution, which
Yeah.
can be incredibly dangerous.
Especially when we're talking about critical equipment. The example that comes to mind is the Hexcel Corporation case. They ended up paying $15 million for selling defective bulletproof vests to law enforcement vests that were supposed to protect them but could have failed in a life or death situation.
And it wasn't just a few bad vests. This problem extended far beyond just one company. It revealed a systemic issue with the materials used in these vests.
That's a chilling reminder of how high the stakes are in the world of procurement fraud. But now we're about to go even deeper
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting.
into a realm where the perpetrators try to hide in plain sight, the shadowy world of hidden ownership.
Ah, yes. Trying to unravel these ownership structures can be incredibly complex.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep shifting.
It's like a game of smoke and mirrors.
Luckily, we have a GAO report that shines a light on this issue, particularly within the Department of Defense.
Always good to have a light in the darkness.
And what the GAO found is pretty troubling. These opaque ownership structures can lead to price inflation. Imagine one entity creating multiple seemingly independent companies.
Ah, so it gives the illusion of competition, which allows them to drive up prices.
More shell games.
Exactly.
But it gets worse. These convoluted structures can also allow ineligible contractors to slip through the cracks, companies that are barred from working with the government.
Because of past misconduct, sanctions, or even ties to foreign entities.
And when it comes to defense contracts, those ties could pose a direct threat to national security.
You're talking about a whole other level of risk.
That's terrifying. Do we have any examples of that actually happening?
Unfortunately, yes. There was a case where an ineligible foreign manufacturer used a U.S.-based shell company to secure contracts with the Department of Defense. They were illegally exporting sensitive military data.
They were caught, right.
Oh yeah, and to make matters worse,
What? It gets worse.
they were providing faulty parts.
Faulty parts, how bad are we talking?
Bad enough to ground nearly 50 fighter jets.
Are you serious?
This case really highlights the very real dangers of hidden ownership in defense contracting.
That's a chilling thought. So what is being done to address this hidden ownership problem? Are there any solutions on the horizon?
Well, the good news is that the DoD has taken steps to address this issue, particularly in recent years. Back in 2014, there was a big push to update the Federal Acquisition Regulation.
The FAR.
Yes, the FAR. And this resulted in companies wanting to do business with the government having to disclose more ownership information.
So more transparency, at least in theory. Where's all this information going?
It's all compiled in a system called the System for Award Management, or SAM. It's a centralized database that government agencies use to vet potential contractors.
So the DoD is using this data to connect the dots between who's providing what and where their allegiances might lie.
Exactly. It's all about assessing risk, especially when we're talking about essential equipment and national security. But it's not a perfect system.
What are the challenges?
Verifying all this ownership information is a huge undertaking. There's a massive amount of data, and it's easy for companies to create extremely complex structures that are designed to obscure the truth.
It's like trying to catch a shadow.
It can feel that way sometimes.
So what can be done? How do we stay one step ahead of these elaborate schemes?
Well, that's where strong internal controls come into play. We need to make it much harder for fraud to go undetected in the first place.
What kind of layers are we talking about? Give us the details.
We're talking about things like clear and comprehensive procurement guidelines, proper segregation of duties, so no single individual has too much control, robust record keeping, and regular audits to ensure accountability.
It sounds like a multi-pronged approach is key here, addressing everything from individual accountability to systemic vulnerabilities.
You got it. And that includes promoting a culture of transparency and ethical conduct right from the start. It's not just about catching the bad guys after the fact. It's about creating an environment where fraud is less likely to occur in the first place.
No, that makes sense. But what about those high-pressure situations like natural disasters? It seems like those situations would create a perfect storm for fraud.
You're absolutely right. Emergencies can create an environment ripe for exploitation. When there's an urgent need for goods and services, the usual checks and balances can sometimes fall by the wayside.
So how do we prevent that from happening?
One of the most effective solutions is being prepared. Instead of scrambling to find vendors and procure supplies in the heat of the moment, what if we already had essential goods stockpiled?
That makes a lot of sense, being proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly.
It's like having that emergency kit ready to go before disaster strikes.
Exactly. It eliminates the need for rushed decisions that could leave the system vulnerable to fraud. And this can even extend to having pre-negotiated contracts with trusted suppliers, so there's no question about who to contact when a crisis hits.
That sounds incredibly efficient and definitely helps minimize the risk. But what about those situations where you can't possibly predict everything you'll need? How do you ensure that aid reaches the intended recipients and doesn't end up in the wrong hands?
You're talking about beneficiary monitoring. and it's a critical aspect of preventing and detecting fraud, especially in emergency situations.
So how do you actually make that happen? How do you give beneficiaries a voice in this process?
It can take many forms. The key is to establish clear and accessible channels for people to report any concerns or suspicions they might have.
So things like hotlines, feedback forms, or even community meetings where people can voice their concerns directly.
Precisely. It's about empowering people to speak up if they see something that seems off.
Because they're the ones who are directly impacted by these programs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's not enough to just provide the means to report. Those reports need to be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. That means having systems in place to handle those reports confidentially,
Right.
protect whistleblowers from retaliation,
Of course.
and hold wrongdoers accountable.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's about building a culture of accountability from the ground up. But how do we ensure that these reports actually lead to meaningful action? How do we prevent them from just disappearing into a bureaucratic black hole? We'll find out right after this short break. Don't go anywhere. So before the break, we were talking about empowering beneficiaries to become these active participants in preventing fraud.
Right, getting them involved.
But how do we make sure those reports they're making actually lead to real change?
Well, that's where strong internal controls within government agencies and contracting companies become absolutely crucial.
Internal controls.
Yeah, it's about having a system in place that's really designed to catch these potential problems before they balloon into major issues.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
So think of it as building this culture of accountability and transparency at every level.
Okay.
This means having clear procurement guidelines, a clear division of responsibilities so no one person has too much control, meticulous record keeping, and of course regular audits to make sure everything is on the up and up.
So it's like a safety net catching those mistakes or intentional wrongdoings before they cause significant harm.
Exactly. And it also involves making sure everyone involved in the procurement process understands the rules of the game,
Okay.
from the folks negotiating the contracts to those managing the projects and even the suppliers themselves.
Right.
Everyone needs to be aware of the consequences of breaking the rules.
So education and training are key components in preventing fraud.
Absolutely, knowledge is power. And that's where the fraud examiner's manual comes in handy again.
Okay, how so?
It goes beyond simply detecting fraud.
Yeah.
It provides a blueprint for building a more ethical and resilient procurement system.
So it's like giving everyone the tools and knowledge to spot those red flags and say, hey, this doesn't look right.
You get it. It's about fostering that sense of shared responsibility, so we're not just relying on catching fraud after it happens,
Right.
but preventing it from occurring in the first place.
That brings up another interesting point. We live in a data-driven world.
We do.
What role can technology play in this fight against procurement fraud?
Technology is a game changer, my friend.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Think about the power of data analytics to uncover hidden patterns and anomalies that might point to fraudulent activity.
So it's like having a superpowered detective working behind the scenes, connecting the dots, and spotting those subtle clues that humans might miss.
Precisely. Let's say someone is submitting invoices for work in 2 different cities on the same day. Physically impossible, right? Data analytics can flag those inconsistencies, instantly raising a red flag for further investigation.
It's amazing how much information is embedded within data. What else can technology help us with?
We can use it to monitor pricing trends, looking for unusual spikes or discrepancies that might indicate collusion.
Okay.
It can help identify potential conflicts of interest by analyzing relationships between individuals and companies.
Uh-huh.
And of course, it can track the flow of funds, highlighting any irregularities that might indicate kickbacks or other illicit activities.
It sounds like technology is giving us incredible tools to combat fraud. But with all this data flying around, how do we ensure it's used responsibly? What about privacy concerns?
You raise a valid point.
Hmm.
It's crucial to have robust safeguards in place to protect sensitive information
Right.
and to ensure these powerful tools are used ethically and responsibly.
So it's a balancing act between leveraging technology's potential while also mitigating the risks.
Exactly, and that's why it's an ongoing discussion.
Right.
But the fact remains, in an increasingly complex and globalized world, technology is not just an option, it's a necessity in the fight against procurement fraud.
It's almost like an arms race with both sides constantly developing new tactics and countermeasures.
That's a great way to put it. It highlights how important it is to stay ahead of the curve, always adapting and innovating to ensure we're equipped to deal with these emerging threats.
This isn't a one-and-done situation. It's an ongoing process of vigilance and continuous improvement.
Couldn't agree more. And it requires a collaborative effort. Government agencies, industry partners, and even everyday citizens all have a role to play.
We all have a stake in making sure taxpayer dollars are being used responsibly and ethically. So how can our listeners as individuals make a difference in this fight against procurement fraud?
Well, it starts with awareness. Stay informed about procurement fraud cases.
Okay.
Pay attention to news reports. Look into government audits and see what industry publications are saying.
So don't just scroll past those headlines.
Right.
Take the time to understand the issues at play.
Exactly. And if you work in an organization that handles government contracts, familiarize yourself with your company's anti-fraud policies and procedures.
Good point.
Don't be afraid to ask questions and speak up if you see something that doesn't seem right.
You have a voice, and it's important to use it.
You got it.
Yeah.
And lastly, as a citizen, engage with your elected officials.
Okay.
Demand transparency and accountability in government spending.
Hold their feet to the fire.
Exactly. Ask questions, stay informed, and advocate for stronger anti-fraud measures. You have a right to know how your taxpayer dollars are being spent, and you have a voice in shaping a more ethical and accountable system.
It's about reclaiming that power and demanding better. But where do we go from here? We've talked a lot about the how of procurement fraud, the schemes, the red flags, the preventative measures, but I'm curious to explore the why.
The why.
Sure.
That's a question that often gets overlooked,
Right.
but it's absolutely crucial to understanding how to tackle this issue effectively.
What drives individuals and organizations to engage in these risky behaviors in the first place? What's going on behind the scenes? Let's unpack that right after this quick break. So before the break, we were really digging into this whole idea of the motivations behind procurement fraud.
Right, the why.
Yeah, it's easy to just slap a label on these people, call them greedy, and be done with it. But I have a feeling it's a lot more complicated than that. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's rarely just about greed.
Yeah.
To really get it, why someone might engage in these schemes, we need to consider the pressures they face, the incentives. It's a whole picture.
Okay, so what are some of the factors that might, lead someone down this path?
Well, for some, it's straight up desperation,
Mm-hmm.
unexpected medical bills, a family struggling to put food on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Others, they might be driven by a sense of entitlement, like they're not being compensated fairly for their work.
It's that classic needs versus wants dilemma, but amplified, right? The stakes are so much higher.
Exactly. And let's not forget about, ethical compromises. Those can be a real slippery slope.
How so?
Well, it might start small, right? Bending a rule here, overlooking something there. But then over time, those small compromises, they snowball. They turn into larger acts of fraud. It's a slippery slope.
Definitely a cautionary tale. But what about organizations? What motivates them to dive into this fraudulent behavior? They're not dealing with the same personal pressures as an individual, right?
True, but they've got their own brand of pressure.
Like what?
Think about the constant drive for bigger profits, the need to hit those performance targets quarter after quarter.
Right.
And the competition, oh man, the competition for government contracts is fierce. These factors, they can create a breeding ground for unethical behavior if it's not kept in check.
It's like this pressure cooker. Something's got to give eventually.
That's a great way to put it. And, in some cases, a company's culture itself might actually be part of the problem. If they don't prioritize ethical conduct, if there's this unspoken agreement to look the other way when something questionable happens, it creates a breeding ground for fraud to take root and thrive.
So it's not enough to just have the rules. It's got to be deeper than that. You've got to foster this culture of integrity and accountability at every level of the organization.
100%. And that's where all those preventive measures we talked about earlier come in. You've got to create this system where individuals, they feel valued, they feel supported, where they're encouraged to do the right thing, even when it's hard.
It's like creating this work environment where ethics, it's not just some words on a poster in the break room. It's got to be a core value woven into everything they do.
Exactly. It's about fostering a sense of shared responsibility, encouraging people to speak up if they see something fishy, without the fear of retaliation.
So it's about addressing this whole thing from both angles, the individual and the organizational factors that contribute to fraud. There's no quick fix, no magic bullet.
You got it. It's an ongoing process demanding constant vigilance, adaptation, and a real, genuine commitment to ethical conduct at every level.
This has been such a fascinating conversation, a real eye-opener into this whole world of procurement fraud. And if there's one thing I'm taking away from this, it's that we all have a role to play in fighting it. Whether you're a government employee, work for a contractor, or just a concerned citizen, awareness, education, and that commitment to ethical conduct, they're essential.
I couldn't agree more. It's about working together, to create this system that's transparent, accountable, and ethical, one that actually serves everyone.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed this journey through the intricate world of procurement fraud as much as we have. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and keep asking questions.